The morning of October 14, 1953, began like any other for Arthur Whitmore. He arrived at the National Archives at 8:47 a.m., precisely 7 minutes early, as he had done for 11 years. His desk sat in the basement, surrounded by towers of filing cabinets that stretched toward the ceiling like gray monoliths. The air smelled of dust and old paper, a scent Arthur had grown to find comforting. At 9:15 a.m., his supervisor, Mr. Blackwell, descended the stairs with unusual haste. He carried a folder sealed with red wax, marked with a symbol Arthur didn't recognize, a triangle within a circle. "Destroy this," Blackwell said, his voice lower than usual. "Burn it completely. No copies remain." Arthur took the folder, feeling its unexpected weight. Inside were documents pertaining to one Dr. Heinrich Voss, a physicist who had worked at the university until 1949. The papers showed employment records, publication history, and then a gap, 3 years of nothing, followed by a termination notice dated 1952. Arthur fed the pages to the furnace in the sub-basement, watching the name Voss curl and blacken. He thought nothing of it, bureaucracy consumed lives daily, but at 2 p.m. Blackwell returned with another sealed folder, then a third at 4:30. By evening, Arthur had destroyed the records of 7 people, none connected by profession, location, or age. Only the symbol connected them. Arthur dreamed of fire that night, not the controlled burn of the archive furnace, but something hungrier, consuming faces he couldn't quite remember. He woke at 3 a.m., his wife Alina sleeping soundly beside him, and went to the kitchen for water. The faucet dripped in rhythm with his pulse. He thought of the names, Voss, Chen, Morrison, Patel, 2 Smiths, and a woman named Eileen Graves whose photograph had fallen from her folder, a young woman with serious eyes and a brooch shaped like a bird. He hadn't been meant to see that photograph. It had slipped through before the flames took it. The next morning, Arthur arrived at 8:42 a.m., 5 minutes earlier than habit. Blackwell was waiting at his desk, 2 folders already stacked. 8 and 9, his supervisor said, offering no explanation. Arthur took them to the sub-basement without opening. The furnace roared its approval, but this time he paused. Folder 8 contained military service records. Folder 9, medical histories. These people had existed in systems beyond the archive, systems that would notice their disappearance, unless those systems were being scrubbed simultaneously. The thought chilled him more than the basement air. He was not merely destroying papers. He was participating in something coordinated, something vast. He thought of Eileen Graves's brooch and wondered if she was still alive to wear it. By Friday, Arthur had destroyed 43 files. The work consumed his days, leaving him exhausted and silent at dinner. Alina asked what troubled him. He said nothing, kissed her forehead, and pretended to sleep. On Saturday, he broke routine. Instead of going home, he visited the public library on 5th Street, where the newspaper archives were open to any citizen with patience. He searched for Dr. Voss. Nothing after 1949, no obituary, no departure notice, no scandal. A man who had published 12 papers simply ceased to exist in the record. He tried Eileen Graves, a birth announcement in 1923. A graduation notice in 1945, then silence, not death, silence. Arthur understood then that he was erasing not the dead but the inconvenient. The system was digesting people and excreting absence. He returned to the archive Monday to find Blackwell absent. In his place sat a man Arthur had never seen, younger, with eyes that didn't blink often enough. "Continue," the man said, sliding 5 folders across the desk. "Your supervisor has been reassigned." Arthur opened the first folder and found his own handwriting inside, a transfer request he had never submitted, dated 3 weeks prior, requesting movement to the sub-basement. He had been selected, not assigned. The realization settled in his stomach like cold lead. Arthur continued burning. What choice existed? The folders arrived with mechanical regularity, 9 each morning, 3 after lunch. The man with the blinking eyes watched sometimes from the doorway, sometimes not. Arthur named him Blink in his thoughts, a small rebellion. He began to memorize details before the flames took them. Sarah Chen, violinist, had performed at the White House in 1951. James Morrison owned a hardware store in Detroit, employed 12 people. The folders contained not just official records, but personal effects, photographs, letters, a child's drawing of a house with smoke rising from the chimney. Arthur burned these too, though his hands shook. He started keeping a journal, hidden behind a loose brick in the sub-basement. Names, dates, the triangle circle symbol, evidence that someone had existed, even if the state denied it. On the 15th day, he found a folder with no name, only a number, 784. Inside, medical records from an institution in Maryland, treatment notes for paranoid delusions regarding government surveillance, and a photograph of a man who looked remarkably like Blink. Arthur studied the image, then his supervisor. The resemblance was unmistakable. He burned the file quickly before Blink could notice his hesitation. That night he added to his journal, "They erase even their own." The weather turned cold in November, but the furnace kept the sub-basement sweltering. Arthur worked in shirt sleeves, sweat mixing with the dust on his forearms. He had destroyed 200 files by his count, though the official log showed only 50. The discrepancy troubled him until he understood the log itself was being edited. Reality was a palimpsest, written and rewritten while he watched. He began to test the system. In folder 203, he removed a photograph before burning, a woman standing before a lighthouse, her face turned toward the sea. He hid it in his journal's brick cavity. No one noticed. In folder 217, he pocketed a letter, a love note in French, the ink still fragrant. The machine kept feeding him folders, indifferent to his small thefts. He was becoming a collector of ghosts, a museum of the erased. Alina commented on his weight loss, his silence at breakfast. He told her the archive was undergoing reorganization, a massive project. She believed him because she had no reason not to. The lies came easier now, lubricated by necessity. On November 17, he received a folder containing his own address, his own telephone number, a photograph of Alina in her garden. The accompanying note read, "Continued cooperation ensures continued existence." He burned the folder, but the photograph he kept, pressed against his heart as he walked home through the dark. Arthur's journal grew heavy with stolen lives. Behind the brick he had accumulated 43 photographs, 12 letters, a wedding ring, a set of keys, and a child's wooden horse. Each item represented a person the state wished to unmake. He studied them at night, by flashlight, memorizing faces that no longer officially existed. Sarah Chen with her violin, Eileen Graves with her bird brooch. A man named Thomas Reeves who had written poetry in the margins of his employment records. Arthur began to imagine their voices, their routines, the particular ways they might have laughed. He was keeping them alive through sheer force of memory, a single point of resistance in an ocean of absence. Blink noticed his distraction. "You work slower," he observed on a Tuesday, his voice devoid of curiosity. "The files are thicker," Arthur replied, the lie automatic now. "More complex cases." Blink stared at him for 11 seconds. Arthur counted, then nodded and left. The following morning, there were 12 folders instead of 9. Punishment or test, Arthur couldn't determine. He burned them efficiently, showing nothing, but inside he was screaming. The 12th folder contained records for a boy, 12 years old, institutionalized for deviant social tendencies. The photograph showed him holding a book, glasses too large for his face. Arthur kept the photograph. He told himself it was for the journal, for memory, but he knew it was something else. He was beginning to hate the machine he served. December brought snow that turned gray before it reached the ground. Arthur walked to work through air that tasted of coal smoke and secrets. The folders continued, 9, 12, sometimes 15 in a day. He no longer read them thoroughly, couldn't bear the accumulation of detail, but he continued his thefts, small acts of salvage that kept him human. The brick cavity was nearly full. He considered a second location, a dead drop in the park where he fed the pigeons on Sundays. The idea of dispersing his collection, multiplying the points of memory, comforted him. It suggested survival beyond his own erasure. On December 12, he found a folder with his own name. Arthur Whitmore, born 1919, employed National Archives 1942 present, married Alina Halloway 1946, no children, no political affiliations, no security risks. The assessment was neutral, the recommendation maintenance with observation. He was being evaluated, his existence weighed against his utility. Arthur burned the folder slowly, watching his own life curl into ash. The message was clear. His position was temporary, his survival conditional. That evening he told Alina nothing, but held her longer than usual before sleep. He dreamed of the lighthouse from the photograph, its beam sweeping across dark water, finding nothing. He woke with a resolve he hadn't felt since childhood. He would not be maintained, he would not be observed into nothingness, he would act. Arthur's plan formed gradually, like frost on glass. He needed to duplicate his journal, distribute it, create redundancy that the erasers couldn't trace. The technology was simple, a carbon paper set, available at any stationery store. He would copy each night's entries, hide the copies separately, leave a map with a lawyer to be opened only upon his death or disappearance. The original journal remained behind the brick, bait for anyone searching. The copies would survive. He began on a Saturday, working in the bathroom with the fan running to muffle the sound of typing. Alina was at her sister's. He had the afternoon alone. The carbon paper stained his fingers purple, a mark of conspiracy he washed obsessively. By evening, he had copied 3 months of entries. He sealed them in oilcloth and hid them in the false bottom of his toolbox, the one his father had used for carpentry. The next copy would go to the park, buried beneath the third bench from the fountain. The third he would mail to his brother in Oregon, a man he hadn't spoken to in 8 years, with instructions to keep it unopened. Redundancy was survival. Survival was resistance. On Monday, Blink appeared at his desk with a folder Arthur recognized, his brother's employment records from the shipyard in Portland. "Your family is also being reorganized," Blink said, his eyes unblinking. "Efficiency requires comprehensive approaches." Arthur took the folder and walked to the furnace. He didn't burn it. He couldn't. Instead, he hid it in his coat, the first overt act of defiance in 11 years of service. The folder in Arthur's coat burned against his ribs like a brand. He carried it through the day, through lunch in the cafeteria where no one spoke to him, through the afternoon's quota of destruction. At 5 p.m., he walked past the guards with the folder still hidden, certain they would stop him, certain this was the end. They didn't. He reached the street, the cold air, the freedom of the sidewalk he had stolen from the machine. The folder contained his brother's life, birth certificate, marriage license, 2 photographs of children Arthur had never met. He couldn't take it home. Alina would ask questions. She would be endangered by knowledge. He went instead to the park, the bench with the pigeons, and buried it beneath the loose soil of a planter box. His brother's existence, preserved in dirt, waiting for spring or discovery. Arthur sat on the bench until dark, watching the pigeons huddle against the cold. They were city birds, surviving on scraps and memory, like him. He thought of the lighthouse photograph, the woman facing the sea. Had she known she was being watched, had she felt the system closing around her like water? The folders never explained why, only who and when, and finally nothing at all. Arthur stood, his knees stiff, and walked home to Alina. He kissed her cheek, tasted soap and warmth, and went to the bathroom to wash the dirt from his hands. The purple stain of carbon paper remained, faint but visible. He told her it was ink from a leaky pen. She believed him because she loved him, and love was a form of blindness the machine exploited. The new year arrived without celebration. Arthur burned files on January 1, 1954, while the city slept off its champagne headaches. The work had become automatic, his hands moving while his mind wandered to his hidden collection, his distributed copies, his small network of memory. Blink appeared less frequently now, replaced by a rotating cast of supervisors who never introduced themselves. The machine was depersonalizing, removing even the face of his oppression. Arthur preferred it. He could hate an abstraction more efficiently than a man. On January 15, he received a folder that made him pause. It contained his own medical records, a psychiatric evaluation he had never undergone. "Subject exhibits paranoid ideation regarding archival work," the report read. "Recommends immediate institutionalization for observation." The evaluation was dated 2 weeks forward, January 29, 1954. They were predicting his breakdown, writing his madness before he lived it. Arthur burned the folder and added the details to his journal. They were preparing to erase him. The timeline was clear now: evaluation, commitment, disappearance. His own folder would come to some other clerk's desk, his photograph slipping through fingers into flame, unless he moved first. He spent the weekend copying his entire journal, every name, every stolen detail. The work took 16 hours, his fingers cramping, his eyes burning. Alina thought he was preparing tax documents. He let her believe. On Monday, he mailed 3 packages. One to his brother in Oregon, one to a lawyer in Washington, one to a journalist at the Herald whose byline he had noticed: aggressive, skeptical, the kind of man who might open a sealed envelope. Then he waited. January 29 arrived without incident. Arthur went to work, burned his quota, returned home. The prediction had been wrong or postponed. He felt neither relief nor surprise. The machine was patient. It could wait for his madness to manifest naturally. On February 3, Blink reappeared. "Your efficiency has declined," he said, placing a single folder on the desk. "This is your final assignment." Arthur opened it. Inside were his own records, complete, with a termination notice dated today and a forwarding address for his wife in the event of his relocation. The address was an institution in upstate New York, the same facility where File 784 had been treated. They were closing the circle. Arthur took the folder to the furnace. He didn't burn it. He had prepared for this moment, rehearsed it in dreams. He walked past the guards. They knew him. 11 years of routine. Why would they stop him? And into the street. He didn't go home. Alina would be watched, would be used as leverage. He went instead to the Herald offices, arriving at 6 p.m. as the evening edition was being put to bed. The journalist, a young man named Marcus Webb, agreed to see him only because Arthur was crying, tears of rage and relief mixing on his face. "I have names," Arthur said, spreading his final stolen photographs across the desk. 300 names, people who don't exist anymore, and I have the men who erased them. Webb looked at the photographs: the lighthouse woman, the boy with glasses, Eileen Graves with her bird. "Why come to me?" he asked. "Because you're not in their files yet," Arthur said. "Because you still exist enough to be dangerous." Webb published nothing immediately. He investigated, verified, found other clerks in other archives with similar stories. The network was larger than Arthur had imagined, coordinated, systematic, reaching into every department of government. They called it administrative hygiene, the removal of inconvenient persons without the mess of trials or executions. Simply, absence. Webb wrote the story in March, a three-part series that the Herald buried on page 4, then page 12, then stopped running entirely. Too sensitive, the publisher said, national security, but Arthur had expected this. The packages he had mailed were insurance, not ammunition. The real weapon was his journal, copied and distributed, waiting in dead drops and lawyers' safes across the country. On April 1, Arthur was arrested, not by police, but by men in suits who showed no identification. They took him to the institution in upstate New York, the address from his final folder. The building was brick and ivy, deceptively peaceful. Inside, the corridors smelled of disinfectant and screaming. His cell had a window overlooking a garden where patients walked in circles, talking to themselves or to ghosts. Arthur was not drugged, not tortured. He was simply ignored, fed, maintained. The erasure of the living required less paperwork than the dead. He spent his days writing in a notebook they provided, describing the weather, the meals, the sound of the woman in the next cell who sang opera in the mornings. He never mentioned the archive, the files, the 300 names. That story existed elsewhere now, beyond their reach. Summer came to the institution. Arthur watched it through his window, the slow greening of the garden, the patients shedding their gray institutional sweaters. He had been there 4 months. No one had questioned him, no one had asked about his work at the archive. They knew, of course they knew. His incarceration was message enough. He was an example, a warning to other clerks who might consider theft or memory. The system digested its own when necessary. In July, a new patient arrived, a leaner. Arthur saw her from his window, walking the garden path with a nurse, her hair cut short, her eyes vacant. They had taken her too, to ensure his silence, to punish his defiance. He pressed his hands against the glass, leaving prints that no one wiped away. That night he broke his routine. He had been a model patient, cooperative, forgettable. But seeing a leaner erased, hollowed out by medication or despair, broke something in him. He waited until 2 a.m., when the night nurse dozed at her station, and walked out of his room. The locks were simple, mechanical, designed for the mad rather than the determined. He found Alina's room on the women's ward. She didn't recognize him at first. Then slowly, tears formed in her eyes. "Arthur," she whispered. "They said you were dead." He took her hand, feeling the bones too close to the skin. "I was," he said. "Now I'm not." They walked together down the corridor, past the sleeping nurse, through a fire door that Arthur had noticed was never properly latched. The garden awaited, dark and fragrant with roses. They didn't get far. The grounds were fenced, the gate locked, and Alina couldn't run. Her medication made her clumsy, her balance uncertain. They were found at dawn, sitting beneath an oak tree, holding hands like children caught in some minor mischief. The punishment was not physical. They were simply separated, moved to different wings, forbidden to communicate. Arthur was given heavier medication, something that made the world soft and distant. He stopped writing in his notebook. The words wouldn't come, or when they came, they made no sense. He was becoming what they wanted, harmless, forgettable, erased in all but body. But in the softness, he found a strange clarity. The machine had failed. He had distributed his journal, the names survived elsewhere. His imprisonment was admission of defeat, a tantrum rather than a strategy. They could silence him, but not reverse what he had done. The 300 existed in carbon copies, in lawyer safes, in the memory of a journalist who would not forget. Arthur smiled at his ceiling, at the peeling paint that formed shapes like countries, like faces. He had won by losing, survived by disappearing. The thought comforted him as the medication pulled him under, into dreams of fire and lighthouse beams and women with bird-shaped brooches who turned to smile at him across dark water. He was one of them now, a ghost in the system, waiting for someone to remember his name. Autumn brought Marcus Webb to the institution. He had continued investigating despite the Herald's suppression, working independently, following Arthur's distributed clues. The administration refused him entry, citing patient privacy. He camped outside the gates for 3 days, interviewing staff who slipped out for cigarettes, gathering fragments. On the 4th day, Arthur was brought to a meeting room, heavily sedated, unable to speak coherently. Webb showed him photographs, copies of the copies Arthur had mailed, now circulating in underground networks, appearing in foreign newspapers, reaching the desks of congressmen who asked uncomfortable questions. Arthur smiled, recognizing his own handwriting, his stolen memories. "It worked," he managed to say, the words thick in his mouth. Webb nodded. They're closing the program, too much exposure. Your files, hundreds of them, are being restored. Names re-entered into records. It won't bring back the dead, but the living will know they existed. Arthur closed his eyes. The lighthouse woman, the boy with glasses, Eileen Graves, they would have names again, dates, the proof of having been. It was enough, it had to be enough. He was returned to his cell, but the medication was lighter now, the fog lifting. He asked for his notebook and received it. He began to write again, describing not the archive or the files, but the garden, the oak tree, the sound of Alina's singing from somewhere down the corridor. The ordinary things, the evidence of life. Winter arrived with hearings, congressional committees investigating administrative irregularities, subpoenas for men Arthur had never seen, testimony from clerks in other archives who had also burned and stolen and finally spoken. The machine was being dismantled, or at least renamed, relocated, made more careful. Arthur testified from his hospital bed, his words recorded by stenographers, his presence beamed into hearing rooms via technology he didn't understand. He named Blink, described the symbol, explained the process of erasure. The senators listened with faces he couldn't read, expressions of concern or calculation. He didn't care about their motives. He cared only that the names were spoken aloud, given breath after years of silence. Alina testified too, recovered enough to describe her abduction, her drugging, the violation of being unmade while still alive. They were not the same people who had married in 1946, who had planned children and gardens and ordinary futures. They were damaged, marked by the system they had resisted, but they were also, finally, visible. In January 1955, Arthur was released, not pardoned. The institution claimed he had been a patient, not a prisoner, no crime to forgive, but simply discharged. He walked out of the gates with a suitcase of clothes that didn't fit and a check for back wages he hadn't earned. Alina met him at the bus station, thinner, older, but herself again. They didn't embrace. They simply stood together, breathing the cold air, two people who had been erased and rewritten and somehow survived. They lived in a small apartment in Providence, far from Washington, far from archives and symbols. Arthur worked as a clerk in a hardware store, inventory and invoices, nothing that mattered. Alina taught piano to children who would never know what she had endured. They didn't speak of the years in the institution, the files, the fire. The memories existed between them like a third person, present at meals, sleeping between them in the narrow bed. Sometimes Arthur woke with the smell of jasmine in his nostrils. The cologne had been Blink's, he realized later, a signature as distinct as the symbol, and would pace the apartment until dawn, checking locks that didn't need checking. He wrote to Marcus Webb occasionally, receiving updates on the investigation's aftermath. Some men were punished, most were promoted to positions where their skills could be better hidden. The symbol, the triangle within the circle, appeared in other contexts, other departments, other countries. The machine was resilient, but so was memory. Arthur had hidden one final copy of his journal, never distributed, buried beneath the oak tree in the institution's garden during that brief escape with Alina. It waited there, waterproofed in oilcloth, containing every name he had saved, every face he had memorized. A time capsule of the erased. He dreamed of returning for it, but knew he never would. Some evidence must remain hidden to remain safe. 1963, 10 years since the first sealed folder. Arthur was 64, retired, his hands stiff with arthritis that he blamed on the archive's damp basement. Alina had died the previous spring, cancer, ordinary, unconnected to any conspiracy. He had held her hand at the end, feeling her grip weaken, watching her face relax into something peaceful. She had been the only proof that his life in the institution had been real, that the years of medication and separation had happened to actual people. Without her, he became theoretical again, a man who might have invented his own persecution. But the journal copies remained, distributed, multiplying. He received letters occasionally from strangers who had found his names in unexpected places, attics, estate sales, the locked drawers of deceased relatives. The network of memory had grown beyond his control, beyond his knowledge. He was no longer the keeper of the names. He was simply their origin point, increasingly distant and irrelevant. On November 22, he heard the news from Dallas. He sat by his radio, listening to reports of assassination, of chaos, of questions that would never be fully answered. He thought of the machine, of its patience, of its ability to write the future before it happened. The methods had evolved, but the principle remained: control the record, control reality. He went to his desk and wrote a final entry, not for distribution, but for himself. I existed, I resisted, I remember. He sealed it in an envelope with a photograph of Alina, young and smiling, before any of it began. Proof, for whoever might need it, that ordinary people could become extraordinary simply by refusing to forget. Arthur Whitmore died in 1971, 72 years old, in his sleep peacefully, which surprised him. He had expected violence, expected the machine to finally claim him. But perhaps he had become too small to matter, a footnote in a footnote, his resistance absorbed into history as a curiosity rather than a threat. His effects were sold at auction, his apartment cleared, his name entered into death records that remained unaltered. He had in the end been allowed to exist, but the journal he had buried beneath the oak tree survived. In 1987, a groundskeeper discovered the oilcloth package while repairing storm damage. He opened it, read the names, the dates, the descriptions of a system he didn't recognize. He turned it over to his supervisor, who turned it over to someone else, and eventually it reached an archivist who understood what she held. 300 names verified against restored records matched perfectly. The package was added to a special collection, restricted access, labeled Administrative History 1950s. Arthur's handwriting was cataloged, his thefts documented, his resistance made official. He had become, against all expectation, part of the archive he had sabotaged, a file that would not be burned, a name that would not be erased. The groundskeeper who found the journal was named Thomas Arthur Reeves, a coincidence that no one recorded but that would have made the old clerk smile. The machine, in its vast indifference, had finally preserved what he had tried to save. The final entry in Arthur's journal was not written by him. It was added in 2003, when the collection was digitized, scanned by a young intern who read the names aloud as she worked. She noticed that one name, Eileen Graves, the woman with the bird brooch, matched her grandmother's maiden name, a woman who had disappeared in the 1950s, presumed dead, never spoken of. The intern researched, connected, discovered that her grandmother had not died but been erased, institutionalized, forgotten. She had escaped in 1956, changed her name, married again, built a life of deliberate obscurity. She had never told her family what happened, protecting them from knowledge that endangered, but she had kept the bird brooch hidden in a jewelry box unexplained. The intern held the brooch now, feeling its weight, understanding finally why her grandmother had watched the news with such intensity, why she had taught her children to distrust official stories, why she had smiled when they called her paranoid. The journal had returned what the system had stolen: context, connection, the truth of having been. The intern added her own note to Arthur's final entry, dated, signed, "She survived, she remembered. We exist because you refused to stop." The journal was returned to its case, the lights dimmed, the archive closed for the night. But the names remained, glowing in digital storage, waiting for the next clerk, the next searcher, the next person who needed proof that the erased could be found, that the system could be resisted, that memory was stronger than fire.